My name's Eric Pelton. I'm an attorney here in Birmingham, and I happen to be with the Labor and Employment Practice Group for the Federalist Society. We're proud to bring this program to you along with the Lawyers Chapter of the Federalist Society here in Michigan and the Wayne State Student Chapter. I'd like to thank Evan Cantrell, the president of the Wayne Chapter, as well as Dan Grano, president of the Michigan Lawyers Chapter. And a special thanks to Brian Shekel, the program director for the Michigan Lawyers Chapter, who put all this together. You should know that this is being filmed and will be posted on the Federalist Society website in the future. If you care to watch it again or refer it to others, the website is fed-soc.org, fed-soc.org. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Dennis Devaney. Dennis is with Devaney, Jacob, and Wilson here in Troy, Michigan. He's a longtime labor attorney who's worked 20-some years in Washington before coming here to Michigan for the past decade. Dennis is a former member of the National Labor Relations Board. He also served as a commissioner on the U.S. International Trade Commission. And he's been a presidential appointee under 4 different presidents. Dennis is a graduate of Georgetown University Law Center and holds undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Maryland. He's also served as a visiting professor at a number of prestigious law schools, including here at Wayne State in 1995, as well as 1996 to 2001, before taking his position on the International Trade Commission. Dennis, appreciate your moderating today's debate. We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure and privilege for me to be here today and to act as the moderator for this debate. I'm looking forward to hearing the comments from the representatives of the arguments on each side. And I know many of you already know this, but I want to give just a brief overview of sort of the historical backdrop to the right to work debate. As many of you know, in 1935, with the enactment of the Wagner Act by the U.S. Congress, the statute at that point authorized the closed shop. So the federal statute as of 1935, and frankly from 1935 to 1947, enabled the unions to require as a condition of employment that people be members of the union and contribute to the union's efforts as the exclusive representative of the units that they would represent. In 1947, in the Taft-Hartley amendments to the Labor Act, so I mean we're looking for a very long period of time now, the statute was amended and the agency shop and the closed shop were essentially declared unlawful if states chose to enact right-to-work legislation. So 14B of the statute allows states to pass right-to-work laws, and in those states it is unlawful, and there's some differences in the states, but essentially it's unlawful to require as a condition of employment that there either be a closed shop or an agency shop. As many of you know, it's been a very active issue in recent times because the state of Indiana just recently enacted a right-to-work law in the state of Indiana. That law has actually been challenged in court by the Operating Engineers Union Local 150. So there is litigation underway in Indiana with respect to the new Indiana statute. That is now the 24th state in the United States to have enacted a state right-to-work law. I first want to introduce the panelists who have kindly agreed to be participants in this program. First, we have Stan Greer, who is, he received his MA from the University of Pittsburgh, and BS in Language from Georgetown University. He is an advisor at the National Institute for Labor Relations, Senior Research Associate there from January 2002 till the present. Prior to that, he had been an editor of the National Right to Work Committee newsletter. He has a number of publications and writings directly relevant to the topic that's under discussion today, and that is right to work, right or wrong for Michigan. He's joined by, on this side, by State Representative Mike Shirkey, Representative Shirkey was first elected to the Michigan House in November of 2010. He represents the 65th District, and he received a bachelor's degree from the General Motors Institute in 1978 and a Master of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Wisconsin at Madison in 1979. He's a founder and owner of Orbit Form, a leading engineering company that manufactures forming, fastening, and other kinds of things. And he's one of the principal sponsors of proposed legislation for right to work here in Michigan. Over on this side is Professor Zullo. He is a research professor, particularly with respect to auto industry issues. He's assistant research science at the Institute of Labor and Industrial Relations. He, again, is someone who has written extensively on this issue, particularly as it relates to auto industry labor relations issues. And he is joined by Representative Vicki Barnett. State Representative Barnett is serving her second term in the Michigan House. She represents the 37th District, which includes the cities of Farmington and Farmington Hills. As state representative, she has focused on creating good-paying jobs here in this state, particularly with respect to renewable energy and life sciences. She is a spokesperson, obviously, for the view that right to work is wrong for Michigan. And just to set a little of the framework of the background that currently exists, as many of you know, and if you follow the newspapers, Governor Snyder has at least indicated that this is an issue that he thinks may be divisive, and he's not certain that the time is right. Many of you may have seen there was an article in Crane's, I guess it was last week, and there was a survey done, and in that survey, 73% of the business people who were interviewed said they think that the time is right for a right-to-work law in Michigan. On the other hand, you have a number of spokesmen for particularly the major business interest that have suggested that it's too divisive of an issue. It's not the right time. Nicholson, who's the chairman of PVS Chemicals, who's the chairman of the Business Leaders for Michigan, basically has taken the position that, now's not the time, a divisive issue, and a number of other people have gone that way as well. John Ricolta I saw the other night, and he also is sort of adhering to the view that this is too controversial of an issue for this period, and it shouldn't be a high legislative priority at this point in time. With that, I would like to let the people who are the panelists and the people who are actually going to comment on this speak. And the order has been pre-selected. I should tell the panelists I'm going to try and strictly adhere to our time targets. So I'm going to sit out there, and I'll give you a signal when you have 5 minutes left. And then I'll give you a signal when there's 2 minutes left. Hopefully, I don't have to get up and come and say, hey, it's over, and get the hook. But I will give you those signals. The way we're going to go is we're going to let the panelists make their presentations, then we're going to have a question and answer period, and then at the conclusion of the question and answer period, we're going to give each of the panel members an opportunity to give a summary their points, and I'm going to try and hold you on that to about 60 to 90 seconds. Thank you very much. With that, Stan Greer.
Hi, thank you. Oh, I guess you're applauding. You're applauding the Dennis. Yes, thank you, Dennis. Anyway, just to clarify one thing, actually, I do retain a job with National Right to Work Committee. I am the newsletter editor for National Right to Work Committee, and also the Senior Research Associate for National Institute for Labor Relations Research, which is the educational group affiliated with National Right to Work. So Dennis, in his good introduction, he talked a lot about, I guess, business controversy over right to work, whether right to work is good for business or not. And I will be talking about that a little bit tonight, but and I certainly want to address some of the economic claims that have been made about right to work by opponents. But for us at the National Right to Work Committee, at the Right to Work organizations, the primary issue with right to work laws is not, about improving the state's business climate. It's a fundamental issue of freedom and of equality under the law. And the basic question for us is whether the right not to join a union deserves equal protection with the right to join a union. And I'm going to explain in a little bit why I think those rights are not equally protected in Michigan or under federal law, and why passage of a right to work law would bring us closer, much closer to equal protection. Even that would not bring us all the way. But before I explain what I think is wrong with current Michigan law and federal law, I want to point out that in the past, when the right to work issue was debated, opponents of right to work were, in my view, much more candid about what it was that they were espousing. Nowadays, when you hear opponents of right to work talk about it, they talk a lot about majority rule. If a majority of the workers at a workplace or some other bargaining unit favor a union, then all the workers should have to pay dues to that union. But in the past, opponents of right to work were very frank that workers who don't want a union should have fewer rights than workers who want a union. And this came up in the Lincoln case, which went before the Supreme Court in the late 1940s. This was a case brought by organized labor to get all state right to work laws declared unconstitutional. And just to clarify what Dennis said, there were right to work laws prior to enactment of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. There was some question about whether they were legal, both under federal statutes and under the U.S. Constitution. The Lincoln case, was over the issue of whether they were constitutional. And the decision in the Lincoln case, which was a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court that right to work laws are constitutional, actually quoted from the union brief that the court received to persuade it to overturn all state right to work laws. It said, "The right to work as a non-unionist is in no way equivalent to or parallel of the right to work as a union member. There exists no constitutional right to work as a non-unionist on the one hand, while the right to maintain employment free from discrimination because of union membership is constitutionally protected." So basically, workers who want to join a union are first-class citizens and who deserve to have the freedom of association protected, and workers who don't want to join a union are second-class citizens who don't deserve the same protection. Now, nowadays, you hear opponents of right to work laws come at it from a different angle, and they say, well, what is the worry about? The law, the freedom to not join a union is protected by the law. And it is correct that in the wake of the Supreme Court's General Motors decision of 1963, didn't really happen exactly with the Taft-Hartley Act, but in the wake of the General Motors decision of 1963, you cannot be forced technically to join a union even if you live in a non-right to work state like Michigan. But as Dennis added, you can be forced to pay, legally they can be called union dues, but most often in these debates we'll call them agency fees. But in any case, you're paying them to the union, and these can be legally, in some instances, as high as full union dues. So as a non-member, you can be forced to pay perhaps as much as full union dues in order to keep your job. So is that really a right not to join a union? Is that a protected right under federal law or under Michigan law? Let's say the shoe were on the other foot, and federal law said you have a right to join a union, even if your employer objects to it, but if the employer objects, then although you're a union member, you can't pay any dues to that union. Would that really be a protected freedom to join a union? It's my position, and I hope most people here will agree, that that would not be a real freedom to join a union. And similarly, if that's true, then it's obvious that the freedom not to join a union is not protected by current federal law or by Michigan law. I should add, because I'm sure it's going to be brought up here, that you do have the right as a union non-member to pay only for collective bargaining costs. This is a right, incidentally, just like the right not to join a union, that unions opposed, or union officials opposed strenuously before they were actually declared. So unions, when the General Motors case came before the Supreme Court, they said, we don't think that workers should just be forced to pay fees to the union if they don't want to join the union. They should have to become members of the union and submit to union discipline. And only when the court rejected that idea did the unions take up the idea that you're free not to join the union as proof of their benevolence or proof that workers have a lot of freedom under federal labor law. And similarly, before the Beck case and similar cases in the 1980s established that as a union non-member, you don't have to pay dues for anything except for collective bargaining, unions opposed that freedom too. But now that the Supreme Court has said that they can't collect any more than that, they say, look how nice we are. We don't force workers to pay who don't want to join the union to pay any more than for collective bargaining. And that's sort of true, but it's something that should definitely be qualified, because at the same time that federal law says that you can't be forced to join a union or to pay dues for anything except for collective bargaining if you're a non-member, the law also says that union contracts can say you have to join a union within, Dennis could help me remember the number, 60 days or whatever it is after you get the job, or you're fired. And most contracts in Michigan and other non-right-to-work states still say that nowadays. So if a worker doesn't know what his rights are and the union simply reads to him from the contract, then he may well think that he does have to join the union. And the union is under obligation to notify him in some form, but they can do it in a union newsletter, which typically people who don't want to join the union are not going to read. And the second thing is that, all right, you know that you have a right not to be a member, so you tell the union official, well, you say I have to join the union, but I know I don't. And I don't want to pay for anything other than collective bargaining because I know I have that right. The union can say, well, we only spend 0.5% of your dues on things other than collective bargaining, so you have to pay 99.5% of dues. And unless the worker is willing to take the union to court to fight about that, it's perfectly legal for the union to say that. And if the worker does take the union to court, and the court ultimately decides that it was a much larger share of that wasn't spent on collective bargaining, then the union has no penalty other than to give the worker back the money that it took in the meantime, or to perhaps to give the worker back pay if he got fired as a result of refusing to pay what the union said he had to pay. So that's a very limited right not to join. It's an anemic right not to join a union, and what the right to work is about is having a fuller right not to join a union. One justification that's commonly made for, there are two, I said majority rule. If a majority of the workers vote for the union, then all workers have to join. But a separate justification, which is really logically almost contradictory, is the assumption that all workers who are represented by a union benefit as a consequence. I should say that under federal law, as Dennis alluded to, that if a union is deemed to have the support of the majority of employees in a bargaining unit, the union becomes what is called the exclusive bargaining agent, which is really the monopoly bargaining agent of all the employees in the unit. So even if you choose not to join the union, you have to allow the union to bargain your contract terms for you. Now, the unions put that a different way. They say, well, that means that you benefit from having the union negotiate all kinds of good terms of employment for you. Well, that's what they say, and that's what I'm sure a lot of opponents of right-to-work laws assume, but the fact is that, academics and scholars who are allied with organized labor and know a lot about these issues and oppose right-to-work laws, when they're not debating right-to-work laws, often openly acknowledge that a substantial share of workers who are subject to exclusive representation, union representation, do not benefit as a consequence of being subject to it. And I take, as an example, there are many others, but this is a particularly pungent one. Richard Rothstein, who is a research associate with the Economic Policy Institute, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C., that is largely funded by organized labor and doesn't take any positions contrary to organized labor. But a number of years ago, Richard Rothstein wrote that a typical result of a union contract is raising pay of the less productive workers, in part by, and these are his exact words, reducing pay of the most productive workers. So essentially, there's compression of wages where some workers get paid more as a result of the union contract and some get paid less. And some might say, well, it may be that some workers benefit more than others, but all workers benefit. But Rothstein goes on to say that unless most businesses are unionized, the non-union businesses will be able to lure away the more productive workers by paying them more, and it won't be sustainable for the union businesses to continue with the same system. So Rothstein is not only acknowledging that the union contract gets them, the more productive workers, to be paid less than they otherwise would be, but less than they would be in a non-union business. Yes? 5 minutes, okay. So it's not the case that all workers who are subject to exclusive union representation benefit from exclusive union representation. There are a number of other examples. I'll just bring up briefly the fact that it's generally believed by scholars of labor policy that regardless of what they think about unions otherwise, that unionization tends to cause firms to grow more slowly and to add employees more slowly. There's some controversy about whether it's commonly denied that unionization causes firms to go bankrupt. I'm not asserting that. But it is generally agreed, even by supporters of unions, that unionization causes firms to grow more slowly. And when firms grow more slowly, of course, there are fewer opportunities for promotions within the firm for an employee to move his way up than there would be if the company were growing faster. So that's a second way in which a worker may logically and reasonably believe that he is harmed by being subject to exclusive union representation rather than helped. I'm going to talk very briefly about economics here. I'll get back to it. The fact is that regardless of what you think that the right-to-work laws ultimately cause, right-to-work laws are correlated with faster growth in employment, and especially in private sector employment. They're correlated with faster growth in worker compensation. I'll get to that in more detail probably later in the discussion today. They're correlated with faster growth in the number of people covered by private employment-based health insurance, or in bad periods like the decade we just had, they're correlated with slower or smaller declines in the number of people covered by private job-based health insurance than in the non-right-to-work states. So they're correlated with all kinds of economic positives, and opponents of right-to-work laws can't really claim otherwise. So they just say right-to-work laws don't cause all those benefits. So therefore, we shouldn't pass any right-to-work laws. And I have a couple of responses to that, but the shortest and the simplest is that the fundamental reason for passing right-to-work laws is that the right not to join a union should be just as protected as the right to join a union. And if you're going to have unequal protection for those two freedoms, then you should have a very, very powerful economic reason for having unequal protection. You have the burden of proof on your side, if you oppose right to work, to show that they cause economic harm. The burden of proof is not on right to work proponents' side to show that the positive economic trends that right to work laws are correlated with are a result of right to work laws. Let's see. I'll just get into in my time left that I'm going to be cut off because I'm getting to something don't really have time to talk about. But one economic positive that is definitely correlated with right-to-work status, I'm not necessarily going to argue it's caused by right-to-work status, is lower cost of living on average. And that's really a matter beyond debate. A number of years ago, I looked at an interstate cost of living index created by researchers for the American Federation of Teachers Union, the second largest teachers union in the country. Presumably, they can't be accused of a pro-right-to-work bias. And if you took that data, they didn't divide it into right-to-work states and non-right-to-work states, but I divided it into right-to-work states and non-right-to-work states and looked at the total number of people in each of those states and worked it out. And the average cost of living, according to the AFT, was roughly 15% higher in the non-right-to-work states than the right-to-work states. So that's really not a matter of debate. So frequently, not always, but frequently when opponents use statistics to fight right-to-work laws, they do not take into account interstate cost of living differences at all. And to me, that makes what they have to say about it just fundamentally suspect and not very useful. How much time do I have left? Another minute. I'll stop here for now.
All right, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Next up is Dr. Zullo, and I should say, you know, I'm an ACC guy, as you heard from Eric's introduction. I went to University of Maryland, but since my daughter and my wife are both Go Bluers, I neglected to say that he is a faculty member and doctor at the University of Michigan.
I forgot to also say I'm a graduate with an MBA from University of Michigan.
Yes, so both of those. So for those of you who are Go Bluers, that absolutely has to be acknowledged.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. Some of what Stan said I have to agree with. The economic arguments in terms of economic development for the state for or against right to work are really quite murky. Part of the problem is that the proponents and opponents sort of take the data and use it for their own purposes. So for instance, they might say, well, if we take a person down south where you find many right-to-work laws and they make $10 an hour, and then you take a very comparable worker up here in Michigan and say that person makes $20 an hour. And now let's suppose that you take both those workers and you give them both a 50-cent wage increase, right? The $10 an hour worker got a 5% increase, and the $20 an hour worker got a 2.5% increase. And so the folks who oppose right to work focus on the $20 an hour and 50 cents, right? And the people who support right to work focus on the fact that 5% increase is better than 2.5% increase. So they're looking at the same facts, but using it for their own purposes. When businesses are surveyed and asked why did they locate to a certain location, right to work comes in very low in terms of priority. Many other factors come before that. Factors such as the education of the workforce, proximity to resources, and the subsidies given by the state. So it does seem to rank very low, and we shouldn't think about it as an economic development tool. Where I disagree with what has been said is that somehow the right to work movement is really about freedom for the individual. And for evidence, I would welcome you to go to the National Right to Work Foundation website and read their stuff. And I think what leaps out at you is quite transparent. They just don't like unions, and a version of their organization has been around since the 1950s. And so what they're about is really destroying the collective. Now let me explain how that works. What right to work does is it disables the union financially. And to understand the critical flaw in the right to work, pro-right to work argument, you have to distinguish between two kinds of collective goods. We have two kinds of collective goods. Economists, social scientists think about collective goods in two ways. There's collective goods which are called excludable goods. Okay? And then there's collective goods which are non-excludable. So let me illustrate. An excludable good would be like a bowling league, where we have an organization, people sign up, they pay their fee to bowl, and every Saturday night they join together and bowl and have fun. They go home. That's an excludable good because basically the people who don't pay don't bowl. If you show up with a ball, it doesn't matter. If you haven't paid your fee, then you just don't get on a roster and you don't bowl. That's an excludable collective good. Then we have what are called non-excludable collective goods, and those are things that we produce as a society, but you really can't exclude people from it. And there's many of them. Most of them are public services. So the roads that we drive on are paid for by and large by their federal or state funds. So they're paid for by all of us. And there's no, we don't have toll booths all over the place charging people to drive on those roads, right? It's a non-excludable good. So people who are not even Michigan citizens, right? People who come up here from Ohio to root for the wrong football team drive on our roads, right? So how big of a crime is that? But but there are many examples. The city parks, for example. If I want to walk out to a city park here, even though I'm not a Detroit citizen, I can do so, and it's a non-excludable good. Most public services are non-excludable. Well, here's the distinction, folks. You have an excludable good like a bowling league, and you have a non-excludable good like a public service. And the fact is, if you want to have some of those non-excludable goods, you have to tax people for it. I mean, there's no other way to pay for it. You can't be voluntary. If we want to have public schools, and if we want the garbage to be picked up, if we want all these collective goods, which you have to tax, and taxes are inherently coercive, because there are some people who don't like to pay, some people who are okay with paying, right? Well, in a sense, the dues that union members pay is a tax. And some people support that union and are okay with paying it, and some people don't and don't want to pay it. But if you begin to take away the ability for the union to tax, it destroys the ability for that union to do things. Now, so the question is a union in what they do more like an excludable good, collective good, or a non-excludable, okay? And I would submit that really they fall more under the non-excludable good. In the workplace is essentially a little mini society. And if a group of workers go up to management and say, this area over here is unsafe, someone's going to get hurt. And if that group of workers succeed in convincing management to change that issue, that hazard, then that benefits everybody in the shop. Similarly, if that same group of workers go forward and say, we haven't had a raise in a while, we'd like a raise, and they succeed, normally management won't just give it to that group, they'll give it to everybody. I mean, that's just the nature of the workplace. It's its own social system, and you can't split out those kinds of benefits between people who gain and people who don't gain. And then there's the other aspect of it, which is much more of a legal aspect. Legally, unions have to represent these people in the bargaining unit. So not only is it non-excludable from a social aspect, but it's non-excludable also from a legal aspect. And the expense sometimes that unions incur can be quite high. An arbitration hearing alone can cost tens of thousands of dollars. And in a right-to-work state, if someone is not a dues-paying member and they get into trouble, the union has a legal responsibility to defend them and to incur that cost, even though they haven't paid 1 cent to the union. So the whole purpose here of the right-to-work effort is to reduce the financing that unions have to carry out their goals, right? And it does so in 2 ways. It creates a pool of free riders because there's always some people within the unit that don't want the union. They don't want to pay, and they won't pay. Okay? Just like if you can imagine in the towns and cities that we live in, if we were all told that paying taxes was now voluntary, right? Well, the payment of taxes has to be mandatory because if you made it voluntary, a lot of people wouldn't pay, and you wouldn't have the money to do all the things that need to be done to finance public services. And so what happens in the union environment in a right-to-work state is it becomes more difficult for unions to actually fund what they do. The second thing that happens, too, which is interesting, is in a right-to-work state, union leaders have to spend more effort sort of doing what's called internal mobilizing, which is they sort of have a lot of parties, they have a lot of gatherings, because they want to keep people engaged. And in a way, that's a good thing, right? It's a good thing for people to be engaged. It's a good thing for union leaders to always to meet up with members, to find out what issues are concerning them, to convince them that that they should stay union members, right? Because they have to do this all the time. But again, go back to the city analogy. You know, if you have a city where the payment of taxes are voluntary, it means the mayor is out there knocking on our door, trying to convince us to pay our taxes, right? And instead of providing public services, they're out kind of groveling for our tax dollars. And in a sense, this is what union leaders have to do. So it means they have less time and less resources to spend on doing other things like organizing new members or engaging in the politics, which are very important to labor unions. So that's how it does. So what right-to-work law is really about is trying to cripple unions financially. And so to me, the large question is here, for us here in Michigan, is do we want a union movement in the state? That's really the fundamental movement. How strong do we want that union movement to be? Okay? And, you know, a sub-question to that, a key question to that, is we have to ask, well, what do unions do? Are they good for the state? What do they do? Well, it's true that unions do compress wages. They tend to be very good at bringing up the base in the workplace. They don't like workers to be paid poverty wages, especially people they represent. They don't like that at all. They don't like it in the general economy, and they try very hard to make sure that their members get paid a decent wage. Okay? Now, what's interesting about this is union members do get paid more than non-union members. That's very strong. That's a very strong finding in the literature. Now, some of that comes at a cost of investors. Okay, but some of it also comes because union environments tend to be more productive. The reason that happens is because when you give workers some protection and you give them a voice, they tend to cooperate more and they actually produce more. So when we think about the kind of economy we want, I would prefer to have an economy where workers are highly productive and they have skills and they're making high quality products. And in turn, those products are helping pay a high wage, which is what you get in a union environment. There's also other issues, too, as well. It's now a pretty well-established finding that workplace safety is greater in non-right-to-work states. My own study looked at workplace fatalities, and not my own, there's been other studies as well that has confirmed this. In union environments, you tend to have lower levels of workplace fatalities. Well, why does this happen? For any of you who have spent any time in unions, you know that in most union environments, one of the most common labor management committees that they have is a safety and health committee. That committee is charged with making sure the workplace is free of hazards. All right? You don't have those kinds of things in a non-union environment. There's just no union to implement it, to enforce the law. What you also see, too, in what unions tend to have is new research is showing that labor unions also seem to spread that equity into the nearby society. In other words, even non-union workers in nearby areas seem to benefit from union labor by having slightly higher wages and better benefits. Another issue is, and this is very important to me, and I think we don't talk about it often enough, is what unions do in the workplace is they do bring in democracy. They elect their own leaders. Those leaders negotiate, And that negotiation resembles the kind of deliberation that takes place in a legislative body. They produce a contract which is analogous to a constitution. And if there's a dispute, they take the issues to arbitration or to a grievance system with arbitration that resembles a court system. They bring democracy into the workplace. And it's actually one of the reasons why many firms don't like unions, is because they do lose some of the power that they did have. So, and now that democracy does appear to spill into the political system. Again, my own research tends to show that where you have more unions, you have more voting you have higher voting rates. And what was particularly important about this finding is that the effect that unions have on nearby society is greater in areas that are poor. This is important because political scientists, when they try to measure how robust our democracy is, one of the measures is whether or not people participate in the electoral system, whether they get up and go and vote. And it's widely known that one of the strongest predictors of whether or not people vote is socioeconomic status. Rich people vote, poor people don't. And what unions appear to do is elevate the amount of voting among the poor. So if you value democracy, then you should at least appreciate this effect that unions have on our society. And finally, there's one more effect, and I have 1 more minute to talk about it. One more effect, 1 more minute. There's research also showing, my own, as a matter of fact. Yeah, I got to always plug my work. That unions also positively contribute to private charity. This is one of the effects and one of the roles that unions play that people don't know very much about. But if you spoke to people at the United Way, they would tell you that one of the biggest donors to the United Way are labor unions. Now, why does this happen? It happens because, as it turns out, labor unions, because they have an organization, are good at encouraging their members to also donate to private charity. And if they're not donating money, sometimes they're donating time. The building trades are known for this. They donate their time to help nonprofits. They build things like wheelchair ramps for nonprofits. They'll take materials, they'll help the poor, contributing their skills with matched materials to try to help the poor. And so this role, this important role in private charities is not well discussed. So for all of these reasons, I would say that having a strong labor movement is good for labor, is good for Michigan, and it's the reason why I think right to work just is not a good idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zullo. Next up is Representative Mike Shirkey.
Thank you, Dennis. I want to make sure that everybody in here is at least still awake. So, by show of hands, how many of you, and leave your hands up, please. How many of you in here know somebody who is unemployed? How many in here know somebody whose child had to leave the state to find a job? How many in here know a spouse that has had to leave the state to find a job? And how many in here know a college graduate burdened by extreme tuition loans, underemployed or unemployed at all? Thank you very much. Virtually everyone in this room raised their hand, and I believe virtually everybody in Michigan would raise their hands to those questions. We don't have enough jobs in Michigan. We don't have enough opportunities in Michigan, and we don't have enough investment occurring in Michigan. Stan did a good job of going over, there's at least 2 critical dimensions to this topic of labor freedom. Yes, I call it labor freedom, where unions are as free to make their case as workers are to make their choice. There will be a test on this at the end, where unions are as free to make their case as workers are to make their choice. 2 dimensions. The dimension of freedom and liberty, an individual choice, but there's also the dimension of economic opportunity. We don't have enough jobs here, and the root cause of that is there's not enough investment going on in Michigan, because that's the only place jobs occur from. Therefore, it is my strong opinion that we must aggressively eliminate obstacles to investing in Michigan. I've had the opportunity over the last few weeks to spend time talking to site selection folks throughout the nation. And just so you know, I didn't gin this up. I randomly selected site selection firms out of Google, called them cold, gave them my name, and simply asked them the question, where in the conversation with your clients does the topic of right to work come up? And I'd like to give you a few of these quotes, and I'm happy to share them as well. From Global Location Strategies, John Sisson, more than half the time, our clients will eliminate, emphasis on eliminate, a location if it is not a right to work state before we are even allowed to share their best attributes. These are word for word quotes. These are not my quotes. Biggins, Legacy, Shapiro. Right to work is often a threshold factor, meaning our clients will eliminate the location without further consideration. This happens at least 60% of the time. Not my numbers, his. This issue does not, here's an important one, especially for Michigan. This issue does not limit itself to manufacturing and industrial clients. We actually have our service and white-collar type clients, like call centers, place more emphasis on this than we would ever expect. Wadley Donovan, from Dennis Donovan. On a scale of 1 to 10, right to work routinely ranks at least 9. If we are proposing our client to evaluate multiple sites, it is always a preference to put non-right to work states lower on the list. More than half the time, not being a right to work state eliminates, there's that word again, a prospective location before thorough consideration. My favorite one, though, is Bob Addy. This guy is known throughout the industry, I didn't know this until a few days ago, as the Dean of Site Selection Services. His quotes were a little different, but I think more profound. More than 30% of the time, this is an eliminator for our clients. Now, 30% is less than 50 and less than 60. But he was emphatic, more than 30% of the time. He goes on, it is important to highlight that site selection is a process of elimination. To be efficient with our time, the site selectors, and our clients' money, we purposely look for reasons to disqualify candidates so we can quickly get to the smallest number of options and then focus. Lastly, and I think this is a one that really touched me, right to work is even more important to foreign investors. They are not concerned about wages, but they are always concerned about the effect on labor rules and regulations. They desire minimum uncertainty and maximum flexibility, and they see unionism as a major obstacle. The key here in Michigan, I think, is that we can never know, we can never quantify how many opportunities we lose, how many companies won't even consider us as long as we continue to carry the burden of being a compulsory union state. It is, therefore, in my mind, a major objection often cited by more than just these relocation specialists. The best, most recent example is Boeing. I spoke personally to an executive at Boeing. When they came down to the final selection, our Willow Run plant was one of the final 3. Everybody knows now, because it's been national news, that they selected South Carolina. I dare you to join me in listing all the attributes necessary to have a successful high-tech operation, a successful high-tech manufacturing operation. And I dare you to find one attribute that South Carolina could trump Michigan in, except one. I do not represent labor freedom as a panacea. It is broadly recognized as an obstacle to investment. Isn't it our obligation, to eliminate it? Indiana recently raised the bar. Here we have a border state now. What will sophisticated business owners choose? To wit, Boeing. Now, my personal interest on this topic started 37 years ago. I was 19 years old. You can do the math on how old I am. 5 minutes. Production supervisor, AC Spark Plug, Flint, Michigan. And when my first belt broke on the conveyor drive. My first mistake was I tried to fix it myself. Big problem. But when I discovered I had to call 5 tradesmen to the site to fix it, I couldn't understand how a business model like that could work. Now, to be fair, most of those duplicitous work rules have been addressed, particularly within the auto industry, but not all. It's been 75 years that unions have enjoyed special, I call it monopolistic protections by government via the Wagner Act that Stan referred to. This act virtually deemed unions as pseudo-government entities. This has resulted in union leadership believing and acting like they're democracies. This false claim severely limits the natural and constitutional rights afforded individuals by our First Amendment Constitution. Labor Freedom Bill would not in any way impact the right of hardworking tax-paying citizens who may choose to associate with an organized labor group. Labor freedom would provide hardworking tax-paying citizens who choose to associate with unions more influence on their unions, more specifically on their union leadership. My passion is for Michigan to become a labor freedom state where unions are as free to make their case as workers are to make their choice. Nothing in this legislation, intended or unintended, prohibits or even inhibits union membership. This is about freedom, workers' choice, and more importantly to me in this particular environment, removing all obstacles to investment in Michigan. We all have endured all the migration we need of our youth and our skilled people moving out of the state. Michigan is not alone in that migration. In the last 10 years, 2.5 million people have migrated from compulsory union states to right-to-work states. And those same states have lost 25 congressional seats. It's time we did everything we possibly can to allow Michigan to regain its economic prosperity. Thwart the exodus of our youth and remove all obstacles to investment in Michigan. Labor freedom protects the rights of workers who appreciate the value of their union, and it protects the rights of workers whose interests are not being met. Labor freedom is where unions are as free to make their case as workers are to make their choice.
Thank you very much, Representative. We'll hold the questions. The agreement was that as to the representatives, they each would have 10 minutes rather than 15. And so now next up is Representative Vicki Barnett. I should note, by the way, in addition to representing her district, she is the Democratic whip in the House of Representatives here in Michigan.
What a colorful introduction that is. I'm also the former mayor of Farmington Hills, which enjoys a very robust global business climate. I want to start out, we've been all over the map today on a whole variety of things that we're talking with right to work, personal freedom, economic, that it's an obstacle to businesses coming here. So I want to address some of them briefly. And I understand that I want to thank the Federalist Society for putting this on, and I know that this can sometimes be a boring topic, but I really appreciate all of you for coming here to listen to us talk about what we consider to be a very important topic of discourse in the Michigan legislature. First, personal freedom. We have to be careful when we talk about personal freedom that we don't allow the minority to control the will of the majority. Now, I understand that the rights of minorities always need to be protected, but you cross a very fine line when you say that a few members of a workforce should have more power than the majority members of a workforce. And what I mean by this is when we talk about personal freedom, we're operating so far under all of the discussions we've had as if there is only one company in a town and the only place you can get a job is with that company, and that company happens to have a union representative that bargains for the employees. That's just not the case. You have freedom of choice, and you can exercise that. If you don't want to work there because there's a union, you are under no obligation to work there. Just as an investor, if I don't want to invest in a particular company because I don't like what they do or I don't like how they treat their workers, I'm under no obligation to buy their stock. So freedom is a very important goal and a very important principle in this country, and we have to take it seriously. But I think that you can sometimes go too far. I don't have the freedom in my community to say, I don't want to pay for garbage pickup. And we talked about public services because that's really where you see it happen. I know that our moderator happens to live in Commerce Township. Many communities in Commerce Township have homeowners associations, and those homeowners associations have dues. And one of the things that those dues are used for is to plow the snow in the winter so that they don't have to wait for the county road patrol to come by and plow the streets. And I bet that the average person in a homeowners association who willingly pays those dues to make sure that those roads are plowed knows who the neighbors are that refuse to pay those association fees because they are freeloaders. You have to plow their road anyway. So I want to make it very clear that, and we've heard it before, but we really didn't expound on it very much, that the National Labor Relations Act is very, very clear. No one ever is forced to join a union. There is no such thing in this country as compulsory unionism, and it's very clear. The National Labor Relations Act says it very clearly. If you are in a shop which is represented by a union, and if they happen to have a clause agreed upon by the owner of the business or the major board of directors and the representative of the union that says, if we bargain for these individuals, we would like them to have to pay the cost of the bargaining. Only then, with an agreement by the business directors or owner and the union that represents the majority of the workers, only then is there a clause where workers would be asked to pay for the cost of administering that contract that they live under. I want to go to one other thing. We can't treat all unions the same, and we shouldn't treat all unions the same. And while there certainly is, as Professor Zullo has talked about, some compression, I don't think that Cecil Fielder really believes that the Players Association, which is a union, has harmed him in managing to negotiate a $125 million contract over 9 years. So as the economy evolves, so do unions and so do businesses. And right now, unions are partnering with businesses in a very, very important way to make sure that businesses survive. At the end of the day, both workers and business owners are on the same side. People don't want their businesses to go bankrupt. They don't want to lose their jobs. Look at the concessions that the UAW members gave to GM and to Chrysler and to Ford to make sure that those companies could compete. To say that they don't negotiate, that they don't do concession bargaining, that they're not living in the real world is just not true. So I wanted to address those things off the bat. I also want to address something that my dear representative friend said about making sure that we have every tool in the arsenal to grow the economy and to bring jobs to the state of Michigan. Right to work does not create jobs. It does not create an opportunity for you to be guaranteed a job, nor does it actually correlate at all to businesses moving into a state. And the number that's normally used is an average. That if you take an average of all the right-to-work states, you will find that in this economic downturn, that the average of right-to-work states have had a higher employment rate than the average of the free bargaining states. And you know what? That's true. But it doesn't tell the whole story any more than the following illustration from my science studying son who's getting his PhD in physics told me. You have three statisticians. They're hunting in the woods. They see a deer. The first statistician fires and misses 3 feet to the right. The second statistician fires and misses 3 feet to the left. The third statistician jumps up and down and says, "We got him." On average, they did get him, but it certainly doesn't tell the story. So when we look at those numbers and say on average, that's true. What it doesn't say is that during this economic downturn, 11 out of the top highest unemployment states, 8 of those states were right-to-work states, and 3 were free bargaining states. It would be like me telling you that right now, the 2011 state-by-state obesity rankings show that out of the 11 top highest obese states in the nation, 8 of them are right-to-work states, and 3 are free bargaining states. We would not then draw the conclusion that right-to-work leads to obesity. So we have to be very careful when we use statistics and really show the point that the last state that went right-to-work was Oklahoma. And since Oklahoma went right-to-work in the year 2000, it's lost over a third of their manufacturing jobs. In fact, immediately, jobs pulled out and went to Mexico and China. That's because we have to recognize that we're in a global economy. And if you're going to go to the cheapest place to do work, you're going to go overseas. That's not the race we want to win, and it's not the race we want to be in. Addressing another question regarding site selection and where businesses want to go, the Director of North American Site Selection for Toyota, Dennis Cuneo, said that right-to-work didn't even enter into the negotiations or the discussion of where they were going to locate plants. I'd also want to point out that the home of Boeing is Washington, and it is a free bargaining state. Also, when you look at where these companies are going, Tesla Motors Company, an electric manufacturer of automotives, high-end, just opened up another plant in California, a free bargaining state. Fisker Automotive will begin production of its premium plug-in sedan in Delaware, a free bargaining state. That Ralco Industries, a producer of stamping and welding assemblies, recently announced plans to invest $6.4 million in a Pontiac facility. GM and Ford and Chrysler are all adding workers to their Michigan plants, a free bargaining state. Grocery stores are expanding in the state of Michigan, and even the governor in his State of the State address trumpeted the amount of commerce that is coming to Michigan and growing in Michigan, a free bargaining state. So when we talk about right to work, when we talk about personal freedoms, when we talk about what we have the ability to do and not to do, I want to remind you that we have to be very careful when we want to hold one institution, labor unions, to a standard of majority rule over minority that is higher than anywhere else where we take that for granted in a free democracy. I also want to add finally that the Economic Alliance for Michigan, which is a large organization made up of business owners, small and large, and labor unions, as well as the Labor Management Association, have opposed right to work for the state of Michigan, as well as Governor Rick Snyder, who says it's not on his agenda, and it's not on his agenda for a very good reason. It draws attention away from what we really need to be doing in this state, and I agree there with Representative Shirkey. We need to be finding a way to create more jobs in the state of Michigan, to improve the education opportunities for our students, to make sure that young, talented individuals have entrepreneurial success in this state, and to make sure that we're on a path for sustainable growth in the future, and that Michigan remains a place where we all want to stay, live, raise our families, and visit our grandchildren right here at home.
Thank you, Representative Barnett. All right, we have some time for questions from the floor. I guess we've got a microphone there, so why don't we start actually, since you're closest to the gentleman in the back. Yes.
All due respect to Dr. Zullo, the elephant in the room is over the agency fee, how much it is goes for political purposes. And you have a tendency to give to one particular party, the Democratic Party. But the Beck decision, the guy got his money back. My sister got her money back as a teacher. How do you figure the actual amount realistically that's going for political purposes and, education? purposes, which are actually political. That's why I'm for right to work, and I was a union steward, and the only people I defended were people who should have never been hired, let alone fired.
Well, okay, I'll try to be brief. Labor follows a political program they have for over 100 years called voluntarism, which essentially means that they aren't aligned with a particular political party. There are occasions when labor will endorse and support Republican candidates. The trouble is that there are very few Republican candidates, at least at the national level, that seem to listen to any of the issues of importance to labor. If you go to the AFL-CIO website, they have a voting histories. They list the issue and they list the candidates and how they voted on certain issues. And if you look at those issues, you'll notice they're not about unions. These are issues about working folks, about wage earners, issues that would help all wage earners. And you're really hard-pressed at the national level to find Republican candidates that are actually, voting with labor on those. And so, as a result, it appears as though their alignment is very strong with the Democratic Party. But, when I was living in Pennsylvania, then Arlen Specter, who was a Republican senator, received the endorsement of Richard Trumka. Richard Trumka was the president of the mine workers at the time, but presently he's the head of the AFL-CIO. He stood up and endorsed a Republican senator. And that was because, at the time, Arlen Specter had a voting record of about 50%, which was very good for his political party, and he was trusted by labor. So I understand that for many folks, perhaps in this room, and for many unionists who feel an alignment with the Republican Party, the fact that some of the dues go to the Democrats might upset them. But there is sort of a reason for that, and it first has to come from the politician. The politician has to demonstrate a willingness to sit down with labor, and then they will get labor's support.
I think Representative Barnett had wanted to have a follow-up, and obviously I give an opportunity to either Mr. Greer or Representative Shirkey.
That's a great question, and I really appreciate that question, because in the new days since the Citizens United decision, you're supporting right to work for a particular reason, and you want to make sure that union dues does not go to political activities, that is not the chosen venue for the individual who's giving that money. And I understand that. I think as shareholders, and I'm hoping you support it because we do have one of these bills in the Michigan State Legislature that would require companies who can now give freely under Citizens United to political candidates, that they disclose as well, because shareholders are obviously not getting all of the value of their shareholding experience if money is diverted from their dividends and their retained earnings to go to political candidates. And they may be buying shares in a company and find out that they don't want to be donating to those political candidates. And so would you support also, and this is a question, would you support that kind of disclosure, that if we're going to make sure that union dues doesn't go to candidates that a particular member doesn't support or non-member, that a shareholder should have the same right and freedom and choice in where their corporate dollars go when they invest in a company?
I just want to briefly say that I find it fascinating that we would use shareholder example in this case. I think shareholders have the ultimate freedom to choose whether or not they want to continue to support a company that may be making contributions in area. Excuse me. I think shareholders have the ultimate freedom to decide whether or not they want to continue to support a company in which they invest in by simply liquidating their position on it. And so I think they have total and perfect freedom, and I think that union members and workers should have the same.
Well, that would be great if those contributions were disclosed, but they're not required to be disclosed. And should they be required to disclose, which is what I'm suggesting, then shareholders would have that ultimate decision to be able to make. And right now, those contributions are done mostly in secret and handed off privately, and there are no disclosure laws in Michigan. We would like to see those disclosure laws enacted.
All right, let's go forward and see. There's some more questions. There's one right here in the front. I'll get to you next.
This is as much a comment as it is a question. My name's Brian Pannebecker. I'm a Ford worker, and I'm represented by the UAW, not by choice. It's compulsory. I can give you a little anecdotal example of how the union operates. When I was 19, I was told by my uncle that Chrysler was hiring to go on down and see a certain individual in personnel and fill out an application, which I did. And I was subsequently hired, and we were going through the paperwork that I had to fill out, and I was told, here's your forms that you have to fill out to join the union. And I was 19 years old, and I guess a little bit naive, and I said, well, what if I don't want to join the union? And the Chrysler employee looked at me and said, son, if you want to work for Chrysler, you don't have a choice. Now that's how it's presented to prospective employees. Now, fast forward to about 16 years ago, I'm a little bit more worldly, a 38-year-old, and I have an opportunity to be hired in at Ford Motor Company. I'm one of those rare people. I've worked for 2 of the big 3 domestic auto companies. Now I know a little bit more about the process. I asked the same question, and I was given the same answer. You have to join the union if you want to work here. Now, he didn't tell me down the road you'll have opportunities to not pay the full. He didn't explain all that. He just said, if you want to work at Ford, you have to join the union. So, and just to finish up my comment, and then I'll listen to your response, I've been told by 2 individuals who held union positions within the last couple of years, because I write, I'm a conservative, I vote Republican, I write frequently about right to work and how I support it. I was told by one individual a couple of years ago that if this was 30 years ago, he looked me right in the eye and stood right in front of me and said this, if this was 30 years ago, you would have had a very unfortunate accident by now. Then I was working on another issue that I was lobbying for that the union didn't like, and I was visited by a union official, and he told me that if I didn't like the job that I was on, to keep up talking about what I was talking about, and I would find myself on another job that I would probably like a lot less. That's how the union operates. That's what I've seen from my personal experience.
I don't know if you were talking to the human resources director at the company or whomever you were talking to, but you should have been informed that National Labor Relations Law clearly says you don't have to join a union. Now, my daughter happens to have worked for 3 of the major auto industries, car companies in Michigan. You told me a story that would happen 20, 30 years ago. Let me tell you what happened 60 years ago. 70 years ago. 70 years ago, if you had wanted to be on the other side and join a union, there would have been people who would have chased you out of a meeting with guns, and they would have shot at you. And they did that routinely. They were called the goon squad that was hired. And my father was one of those individuals who was shot at. Jimmy Hoffa was shot at. I don't know what happened to him after all that, but so we can talk about these kinds of anecdotes time and time again, but the real story here is not the value of a particular union or how you feel. We're talking about trying to create a sustainable economy in the state of Michigan, and whether or not having policy that goes right to work advances that goal or doesn't advance that goal. And I don't want to talk about all the other anecdotes because we're going to find them on all sides. But the real point here is, if all of the facts about right to work, creating jobs in a robust economy, and sustainability and higher wages were true, we would have to be crazy not to go there. But because the evidence does not show that the correlations that are cited are false correlations, much like obesity, that right to work leads to obesity, Because of that and the controversy, there is no hard scientific reproducible data by scientific method that proves that. We have to look at other ways to talk about whether or not one sentence in one contract in all of the things that lead to a robust economy in a particular state makes that much of a difference if there are other things that we should be doing, and stop getting distracted from where we need to go and the kind of climate we need to create, and stop talking about particular unions and all of those things.
I'll say 30 seconds to anybody else, but I want to get some more questions in. So, do you have a brief comment, Dr. Zullo?
No, I think that,
All right, anybody on this side? Mr. Greer.
I mean, I'm just astonished that Representative Barnett basically says, and it's pretty much the same thing Dr. Zullo is saying, that whatever your experience as an individual, you may not think the union's done anything for you. I'm not going to argue with you about that. Maybe the union did harm you, but for the good of the masses, we need to have compulsory unionism in Michigan. I would not say the economic experience of Michigan is anything to write home about, or there's any reason to think that Michigan is profiting greatly as a result of being one of the most heavily unionized states in this country. I don't know what kind of land they're living in, but I know what the data are about Michigan. And she said sustainable for our families. I mean, Michigan has one of the greatest out-migration of young adults and their children in the country. And a large chunk of it is going to right-to-work states.
In the back there.
Hello. In your description of the benefits and things of what a union does for the workforce,
Right.
I'd like to argue that you fail to note on rigidity being one of the items. You mentioned that the UAW is now working with the local car companies on flexibility. What was not mentioned was that for years prior to this bankruptcy issue, all the local 3 car companies argued repeatedly that they're uncompetitive because of wages. And it only was when UAW had their back to the wall in bankruptcy where flexibility stepped in. The other item I'd like to note is that in this country, we have an education crisis that we keep wrestling with. And it's because our education system is based on an agrarian society. We need the kids home during the summer so they can work in the farm. So now we've got this situation where a much more productive education system would be 3 months on, 1 month off. 3 months on, 1 month off. Why can't we do that? Because the teachers' union is inflexible and overly rigid, and they got us by the neck.
That's a great question, but that's not true. In fact, there are many school districts that tried to negotiate year-round schools, and actually it's the tourist industry that stepped in the state of Michigan and prevented us from going to year-round or more flexible school schedules. In fact, they even convinced the legislature to pass a bill, which I was not in the legislature yet, that's mandated that school cannot start until after Labor Day.
Point of order.
That
Dennis,
was a legislative decision, and that had nothing to do with labor unions. And so I want you to understand, in Farmington Hills, we had negotiated from Farmington Public Schools a year-round school program, and it was operating very well. So don't blame the union for something where the legislature stepped in because of the tourist industry.
Well, let me say this. Let's kind of try and get back to the right to work question and whether it's right or wrong for Michigan. I think that's really the topic today. Well, I'll get to everybody. Let's start there.
Representative Barnett, I just wanted to ask a question with respect, and I want to make sure I heard you correctly before I ask the question. With the Toyota person that moved to Michigan, he said that right to work was not an issue, I believe is what you said.
I didn't say they moved to Michigan. I said that right to work from Dennis Cuneo, the president of the site selection for North America for Toyota, said that right to work was not a consideration. It was neither a positive nor a negative.
Okay, and I apologize for saying that they moved to Michigan, but that was what I wanted to make sure. I wanted to make sure that they did not say it was a negative or a positive or negative, that it was neutral. And my point is, that was, if I remember correctly, that was the only statement you made from anybody from a site selection, and it indicated it was neutral. And I think with regard to somebody like Toyota, obviously with the big 3 being here in the auto industries, there'd be reasons why they might say it's neutral in that regard. But I didn't hear anything in your argument as to why you did a very good job of trying to prove the negative. There's nothing that shows that right to work will help our economy. But I never heard anything that says that if we make it right to work, it's going to hurt our economy, or that it at best would be neutral. And so I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Well, I think if you're going to make a major policy change that's going to create conflict between labor and management, and that's basically what you'd be doing, you have to really make sure that there's proof on your side that moving in that direction means that you're going to have higher employment and make all of those positive changes that we all do really want to see in our state. And the facts just don't bear it out, which is why the governor has been very clear. Don't bring this to me. It's not on my agenda. When you look at Site Selection Magazine, and I ask you to go look at it because we also, the Greater Chamber of Commerce, I'm involved in something called the North Coast Project, where we're trying to create an economic alliance of the Great Lakes states. And so in February of 08, and continuing dialogue on that regard, we brought together all of the chambers of commerce of the cities in what is called the Great Lake Basin, or some of you may refer to it as the Rust Belt. So we had people from Rochester, New York, and Chicago, and Madison, Wisconsin, and Kenosha, Wisconsin, and Toledo. All of those cities were right here. We were at the Henry Ford, and we met. And we talked about where they want to locate, what is the biggest obstacle when they look at site selection, what are they looking at? And the things that came up, the top 5, were infrastructure in terms of getting goods in, getting raw materials in and goods out. So infrastructure was number 1. Quality workforce was number 2. Some talked about climate. Some talked about quality of life. Some talked about the ability to be on the Great Lakes where we have a stable energy system and a stable geology, so we're not subject to earthquakes and hurricanes and all of those things. But they didn't mention right to work once. They didn't mention unions once. So that is why when you see the business leaders for Michigan getting together and the chambers of commerce in regions getting together, not the state chamber of commerce, but regional chambers of commerce, they talk about we need to improve our roads, we need to fix our roads, we need to fix our bridges, we may need to create a new bridge to Canada to get goods and services across that. We need to make an investment in the education capability of our students. And the governor just said something that I find very, very enticing. He said we must begin to reinvest in the arts, because those quality of life issues are some of the driving forces in the economy and site selection. And he would know better. He was president of Gateway. So he is tied into the economic community.
Let's try and, I'd like to get in maybe 2 more questions. We're running short on time. Let me say to the questioners, please be in the form of a question. And to my panelists, I'm going to hold you to a 1-minute answer. Who's next? How about
Thank you. Thank you very much. I like the analogy you gave of the deer. You know, it seems like right to work and non-right to work. The unions have improved the quality of life for many citizens. But you don't want the unions to be so powerful that they're a ball and chain to the organization or the companies. So we need to go back to that gray area, hit the deer. And do you guys have any comments on that?
All right, why don't we start over here with Representative Shirkey?
I'd be happy to start with that. I think I'm very proud of the fact that every time I have an opportunity to talk to a group, I make it abundantly clear my interest in Michigan becoming a labor freedom state is not about being anti-union. I can cite many examples where unions have been part of the solution for companies succeeding in Michigan. I'm just saying that there's one thing that we need in Michigan above all else, and that is jobs. And to get a job requires an investment. And investments are based on certainty and objections and obstacles. And I can cite you a chapter and verse where when people are deciding between 2 locations, one, a compulsory union support state, I'll clarify that for my good friend Vicki, and another, a right to work state, everything else being equal, they're going to the right to work state. So I see no reason for us to disparage unions. Now, I won't say the same thing about union leadership. Unions in themselves, I see no reason for us to disparage them.
Mr. Greer, 1 minute.
I want to say that the correlation that Representative Barnett talked about is just not correct, that there are lots of data where it's not a question of it being all over the map. Like, for example, when you talk about employment growth and private sector employment according to the broadest possible measure, the Bureau of Economic Analysis measure over the last 10 years, for which annual data are available, 2000 to 2010, 13 of the 15 states with the greatest percentage growth in private sector employment are right-to-work states. 13 of the 15 states with the lowest growth or with negative growth in private sector employment are non-right-to-work states. So it's a much stronger correlation than she talks about. And also, I want to say just very briefly that data about Oklahoma come from the Economic Policy Institute. Oklahoma did not lose a third of its manufacturing jobs after its right-to-work law took effect. In fact, although 49 of the 50 states lost manufacturing jobs and Oklahoma did lose some, its percentage loss in manufacturing jobs is less than half of the decline endured by a forced union of states nationwide, and also smaller than all of its non-right-to-work neighbor states in the same region. So that's a phony statistic from the big labor-funded Economic Policy Institute.
And to the point about quality of life,
we're running out of time. Let me let Representative Barnett and then Dr.
The
Zullo.
filibuster on that side has been going on long enough. I'd like to add that to the point of quality of life, there's nothing more important to quality of life than freedom.
All right. Representative Barnett.
Yeah,
1 minute. 1 minute.
I mean, I love what he said, but I happen to have the chart of Oklahoma manufacturing employment from 1990 to 2010. In 2000, this was where it stood. This is where it stood in 2010. That's a little more than a third, almost a half.
Well,
so
I
happen to have the chart that was published by the U.S. Bureau of Labor of Statistics in 2011. So we can exactly, when we talk about these things, you can't talk about right to work and the movement of jobs without recognizing that we've had the largest economic downturn.
Representative, Oklahoma's law didn't take effect until 2003. Why are you using a chart going back to 1990?
All right, let's move on.
Because it was growing up until 2000. So you're right. We've had the largest economic downturn since the Great Depression.
All right, let's do this. I'd like to get one more question, and we're running out of time. First will ask the panelists, because there are several people who still have questions. I would request that maybe you informally have an opportunity to address these issues of the folks who have some things that we're not going to get to because of time constraints. If you can stay and talk with this group one-on-one, I would love you to do that. We really have time for one question. He actually had his hand up for a while. Yes, right there, second row. No, right there. Gentleman with the mustache. It's on. Just put it closer.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. I've been involved with unionism for over 40 years. I was a member of Local 594. And the topic I'd like to bring in, because my experience is similar to what this gentleman said. I've seen a lot of compulsory unionism, and I've seen a lot of corruption. I think a couple of my union reps are now sitting in a federal pokey for racketeering. But I'm concerned because, to me, when I hear about this, whether it should be compulsory unionism or whether it should be voluntary unionism, we're still talking unionism. And to me, bad companies deserve union, but workers deserve good unions. And I wondered if in all this, are you folks thinking about maybe compelling the unions to be a little better organized right down to each departmental level so they waste less time, there's less graft, greed, and special interest?
Dr. Zullo, since you wanted to have a chance, why don't I start with you?
Okay, thanks. I was going to answer the question from before, but I'll give it a shot at this one. The Lanham-Griffin Act was actually a pretty good body of law, and it required unions to become more democratic, and that was a good body of law, and that could be strengthened. We could make more democratic unions without engaging in right to work. Again, right to work defunds unions. I don't think that would ever, help us with some of the other problems that have been discussed today. I think a more important constraint we can place on unions is forcing them to become more democratic, and there's ways of doing that. Yeah.
Representative Barnett?
Yeah.
1 minute.
I support transparency and disclosure on both part of the business owner, on the part of labor unions. I think we need to find efficiencies wherever we can find them in any form. And graft is not graft is an equal opportunity employer. My husband had the great pleasure of putting Denny McClain in jail for the second time after he stole $5 million from a union pension plan. And I'm really thrilled as a financial planner that somebody like Bernie Madoff is behind bars. So we all want to make sure that we have safe, legal employers that are doing the right thing and that our unions operate above board, and so do our businesses. And I think that with transparency and disclosure at all levels, including Citizen United, making sure that their contributions are disclosed, will make us all a better place.
Thank you. Mr. Greer?
I think that, there's all kinds of evidence that corruption is a greater problem in unions than it is in other private organizations. And in fact, there is a book by yet another lifelong union member, union organizer, Robert Fitch, that came out just a few years ago that emphasized that point. He said that they're like medieval fiefdoms. And Robert Fitch understands that a big source of corruption in unions, which, people don't want to acknowledge if they like the status quo, is that the individual worker has no power to punish corruption as soon as he sees it by resigning from the union and ceasing any financial support from the union as soon as he sees it. I mean, that's what happens with other private organizations. That's what happens with charities, with business organizations, whatever. And that's reason why corruption, frankly, is endemic to unions to a greater extent than it is to practically any other kind of private organization in this country.
And that's why labor freedom, where unions are as free to make their case as workers are to make their choice, empowers union members, if they choose to be so, with the power of the pocketbook to allow them to have influence on the behavior of their union leadership. And I don't think there's anything more important than that. And this concept of continuing to compare unions and having this false relationship to democracy, the only reason that argument even comes up is because it is deemed so by a law that was written by the AFL-CIO back in 1935. And so there is no reason and no cause and no lawful substance to why unions should even be considered democracies.
Let me do this.
I can't let a comment about corruption in unions go unanswered without mentioning first that there's whistleblower laws.
As you all can see, this is a controversial topic.
And we don't want to defund a union engaging in illegal activities. We want to put them behind bars. So when it happens, just like we do with Bernie Madoff.
We do that until they're convicted, but you can defund them right away. That's the difference.
All right. We're not going to solve this now.
If I may.
Let me say this. I want to first of all thank all of the panelists for being here today with us.
Good closing
It
comments.
was just getting exciting, wasn't it? You guys were all just now waking up.
I also want to thank all of you for coming. We appreciate your being here and being participants. As I said, I think each of the panelists will be willing to stay. I know I apologize, we weren't able, for time reasons, to get to a couple of people. As part of our program, we wanted to give each of the panelists an opportunity to have a final word. I'd like to start with Dr. Zullo, and we'll come across this way. Right. 1 to 2 minutes.
There's so much to say. There's no evidence that unions are more corrupt than other private. There's no evidence. In fact, you can go to a federal database that looks up court cases and convictions, and if you look that up, you'll find that there's far more corruption in the private sector than that show up in unions. But I wanted to just wrap up sort of with the big picture. I think what it comes down to is what kind of economic development do we want to have? What kind of state do we want to have? What kind of country do we want to have? I mean, there's two views out there, and one is essentially sort of that we need to compete based upon low wages, low rights, poor environmental records, dangerous work environments, That's the model in which we're competing with countries like China. Okay, then there's another model, one where we have high productivity, high wages, high benefits. We're producing high quality goods, and with quality products that are based upon workers having collective rights. That's what we see more in nations like Germany. Okay, so do we want to be producing trinkets, or do we want to be producing BMWs? I guess that's the question before us. And one of the interesting paradoxes, too, and I did want to speak to the question about, the productivity of labor, is that, as it turns out, if you look at nations in Europe that have co-determination, that's where unions actually sit on half the boards of directors of these companies, actually what unions end up becoming is very responsible partners linked to making sure that firm succeeds. And that's what they have in places like Scandinavia and Germany. And we can see more of that here. That was at one time advocated by the UAW, and they were never able to get that.
All right, thank you. Representative Barnett.
Yeah, I think this is a lively discussion, and I'd like to pursue it more. We can't solve all the problems in a few minutes. But I don't think that anybody here would dispute that the direction that we all want to go in is to make sure that we have a robust, strong economy where workers have great jobs, where business owners are free to innovate, and workers are also free to innovate and get the job done better, quicker, nimbler, to make sure that we're sustainable going forward. And one of the things that unions do that we haven't talked about at all is the journeyman process when we're talking about our carpenters and our plumbers and electricians. We can't keep putting labor into this one little mold any more than we can put the types of business we do into one little mold. I happen to be a financial planner. Some of you guys are studying law. That's why we're at a law school. There's all kinds of employment opportunities available, and what we really want to do is transition more and more to a knowledge-based economy where we can have all kinds of employment opportunities available. That's the safest, healthiest, strongest type of economy to develop. And to sit here and talk about compulsory unionism and graft in unions without talking about what we really need to do, and that is to have efficiencies at all levels, no matter what kind of organization you run, to make sure that we have people that abide by the law no matter what organization you're in, to make sure that we respect the rights of the minority but we don't let the minority have tyranny over the majority, to make sure that everybody gets a fair shake, and to make sure that we don't have free riders, that everybody pays their fair share for what they get, and that what they get has value, and it builds a strong, viable middle class that supports small businesses across the state so that there's more disposable income and everybody's boat is lifted. That's what we're all working for. And I hope we could agree to disagree on this particular issue, but come together on the fundamental issue of how do we create a better economy in the state of Michigan going forward.
Thank you very much. Mr. Greer.
I think there have been 7 heads of international unions in the U.S. since the late 1990s who've been forced out of office either because they were convicted and sent to prison or because they were indicted and forced out of office as a result of that. That's just in a little more than 10 years. I don't think, and there aren't that many international unions. These are just international unions, not local union corruption. I don't think you would see a similar share of CEOs of Fortune 500s forced out as a result of being convicted or indicted over the last 12 years or so. So I think that there is a reason for saying that corruption is a problem in unions. I also want to say that around the same time as we got the National Labor Relations Act, we hear a lot about democracy. A few years earlier, we got the National Industrial Recovery Act, it's sometimes called. And a lot of people have forgotten this because it only lasts a little while. But under that law, actually businesses were required to form kind of private organizations which would set the terms under which they sold their products, so that you couldn't sell under a certain amount or you were violating this code. And this was, in Dr. Zullo's view, this was much more democratic than where the business gets to choose individually how much it charges its customers, or whether it sells eggs, by all in a mass, or you get to pick out the eggs you don't like, which is ultimately the Supreme Court case, the Schechter case, that overturned this crazy law. When this was overturned a few years later, you know, some of Roosevelt's advisors wanted him to try to pass it again, but he knew it was so horribly unpopular, and the businesses, even businesses thought, oh, we're going to make more money because we won't get undercut by competitors. You know, they liked it when it first started. But within a few years, nobody wanted it anymore. It was intolerable. And yet, the thing that proponents of that law, the mistake they made is they didn't say the businesses have to pay dues to this organization that's setting their what they sell their products for. If they'd done that, we might still have that today, just like we have the National Labor Relations Act today. Similar form of democracy, you know, for business as well as for unions. Business doesn't like that kind of democracy, and I don't think that kind of democracy is in the interest of employees either.
All right, thank you very much, Representative.
Recently had a chance to speak to a group of Teamsters in their union hall. There's about 120 of them. It was a cordial meeting. It was a good give and take. But at the end of the meeting, we had a question and answer session, and somebody stood up and asked me a question, presumably trying to bait me, and said, well, how would you like it if we came to your shop and tried to organize your workforce? And I simply said, well, first of all, it's a free country. Second of all, if you were successful, the first question I would ask would have been, what did I do wrong? As I've repeatedly said, I defend equally the right to belong to a union and to not belong to a union, but I think we've got to be very careful not to perpetuate models that create obstacles and cause for pause for people who want to make investments. By the way, 9 out of the last 10 auto plants, I can't imagine a better state from a technological standpoint to make an investment auto plant, but 9 out of the last 10 auto plants in the United States have been in right-to-work states. Labor freedom has nothing to do with attempting to minimize or eliminate unions. In fact, the matter is, the day before labor freedom bill is passed, there'll be about 17% of workers in Michigan represented by unions. And the day after it's passed, there'll be about 70% if unions deliver value that their members want. Some say this issue is particularly in Michigan, is too divisive. I don't care what collar you wear, a white collar, a blue collar, a yellow collar, a green collar, or if you have ring under your collar. There's nothing more divisive than having your children leave the state because they can't find a job, having a spouse having to leave the state just to provide a living, or having college graduates underemployed because they can't find anything to do to take care of their huge education burden. We need to stop this exodus of our kids and our skilled talent. We need to absolutely focus, rifle shot focus, on every obstacle that's preventing us from having opportunities for investment. I absolutely disagree with Representative Barnett. We cannot create jobs, but we damn sure can create opportunities for investments. And right now, we've got a big obstacle to that. We need to make Michigan the next labor freedom state, where unions are as free to make their case as workers are to make their choice. This train has left the station. It's up to us to make sure we don't miss it.
All right. Thank you, Representative Shirkey. Thank you again to the panelists. Very lively discussion. Thank you to you in the audience. I hope that you can come and have some private conversations. Thanks very much.